I'm really delighted to be here and to begin. The timing is very propitious because today is the official launch day of Assignment China. So in addition to being on Amazon, it's now supposedly going to be available in bookstores. So it's a very good timing. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk for about a half an hour and try and share some thoughts and insights based on this book, which is in itself based on well over 100 interviews that I did with journalists who've covered China from the 1940s to the present day, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. In the summer of 1973, just 1 year after Richard Nixon's historic trip, I made my first visit to China with a group of American students. That's me in the Mao hat and the dark glasses on the right of the screen. One of the places we were taken on that trip was the Wusan People's Commune outside Shenyang. And that's where I met the model Maoist peasant Yu Kexin and was hosted for lunch at his modest home. That lunch was the highlight of my visit. It was a really wonderful experience. So 20 years later, in 1993, when I was CNN's Beijing bureau chief, I thought it would be interesting to retrace that 1973 trip to see how China had changed in the intervening 20 years. I managed to track Yu Kexin down, and I discovered he was now running a tractor repair shop. He lived in a new flat with a television set as a beneficiary of the market-oriented reforms introduced by Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. His life had clearly improved. As soon as local officials were out of earshot, however, Yu confessed to me that almost everything I had seen during my first visit in 1973 had been an illusion. He told me that, in fact, conditions then were terrible, and that even the food I had so enjoyed had been trucked into the city by local officials just the day before in order to impress the foreigners. To me, this episode underscores a central theme in any discussion about the history and experiences of foreign correspondents in China, and that is the challenge of finding the truth in a vast, complicated country with a long history of distrust of outsiders and a secretive and authoritarian political system. This, by the way, is Joe Kahn, who in the 1990s covered China for the Wall Street Journal and then the New York Times, and is today the Times executive editor and one of the more than 100 people whose interviews make up the heart of Assignment China. The stakes couldn't be higher. Over the decades, reporters for the American media, like Evan Osnos, here pictured here of The New Yorker, have played a critical role, profoundly influencing U.S. views of the country and the policies of successive American governments. Moreover, because of the reach of U.S. news organizations like the New York Times, the major TV networks, and the wire services, such coverage has shaped perceptions of China around the world. For many consumers of news, however, the way the information they read in newspapers, magazines, or online, listen to on the radio, or watch on television actually gets there remains a mystery. Few people understand what goes into the reporting, writing, and transmitting of news. This, by the way, is John Pomfret, then of the Associated Press and later with the Washington Post, interviewing student leaders in Tiananmen Square in 1989. Yet, as any journalist will agree, the process by which news is gathered, reported, and transmitted decisively shapes virtually any report. With China emerging as a global superpower and its relations with the U.S. more strained than at any time in the last 50 years, here's a throwback to an earlier era. That's John Sheehan of CBS News with Deng Xiaoping, and behind them is CBS News 60 Minutes correspondent Mike Wallace, a photo taken in 1986. When Sino-American relations were particularly warm. But especially given the climate today, understanding the people who've covered China for the American media and how they've done so is a crucial step to help people understand the news that they're reading and watching. And providing that understanding is the central goal of Assignment China. The story of the journalist in Assignment China begins with the triumph of Mao Zedong's communist revolution in 1949, at which point virtually all American and other Western reporters were forced to leave the country. Indeed, when Mao proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic in Tiananmen Square on October 1st, 1949, not a single American correspondent was there to cover the event. For most of the decades that followed, American reporters had little choice but to cover China from the outside, most notably from the then British colony of Hong Kong. The China Watchers, as they became known, relied primarily on the Chinese media, which they monitored religiously, looking for clues. Bernard Kalb, who sadly recently passed away, was based in Hong Kong for the New York Times and CBS News in the 1950s and 60s.
How do we get information about China? We got bits and pieces. We read everything we could. We put the mosaic of pieces together and try to extract some narrative about what was happening in China. But this was bits and pieces journalism.
It was a frustrating beat, especially when China was convulsed with upheavals like Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution of the mid-1960s, which American correspondents couldn't see for themselves. It wasn't until President Richard Nixon's visit to China in 1972 that the door began to open. At that time, China had been cut off for so long that many journalists, even such network heavyweights as Dan Rather of CBS, felt that it was going into outer space.
It was a little bit the feeling we're leaving Earth and going deep into the cosmos of some distant planet.
In the wake of the Nixon trip, China did become slightly more open to Americans, and U.S. news organizations slowly began to get greater access. Here's Ted Koppel of ABC News with a cameraman in China in 1973. But it wasn't until the U.S. and China established formal diplomatic relations in 1979 that American news organizations were finally allowed to open bureaus in Beijing. The interest in China was enormous. When Deng Xiaoping, who had by then established himself as the country's senior leader, visited the U.S., the images of him wearing a cowboy hat at a rodeo in Texas cemented this notion of Deng as the kind of cuddly communist and of China as an attractive strategic and economic partner for the United States. The economic reforms that Deng initiated heightened this perception, which was fueled by the cascade of stories the newly arrived American journalist did about the changes underway. Jim Laurie opened the ABC News Bureau.
Go back and you look at the programming on ABC and NBC and CBS in 1979, that is very much reflected. China opening up. Every little innovation that occurred in the late 70s that were part of the reform program that Deng was outlining were seized upon. The first private restaurant, the first private car, the first of this, it was all a series of firsts.
But the journalists discovered that living in Beijing was no picnic. They were followed by security agents and found it difficult to have unsupervised contact with ordinary Chinese. Melinda Liu, a Chinese American who opened the Newsweek Bureau, would dress like a local, even taking care to make sure she had local appearing shoes rather than Western shoes to escape the scrutiny of security personnel and mingle with ordinary citizens. But encounters were often fraught. Fox Butterfield of the New York Times met a woman who spoke candidly about sexual behavior and values in China. After his article, which did not name or identify her, was published, the government figured out who she was and imprisoned her. Richard Bernstein of Time magazine did a story about a prison journal he got hold of that was written by a jailed dissident. Bernstein was questioned by police, and the dissident's sentence was increased from 3 to 11 years. Still, by the mid-late 1980s, as reflected in these creations by a new generation of avant-garde artists then, there was a significant relaxing of Communist Party control over China's economic, political, and intellectual life. Arguably, it was the most liberal period in the history of the People's Republic, including, as I remember, the first nude art exhibition, as reformers sought to push the country towards a more open and tolerant system. China's growing openness to the world was reflected in a historic interview Deng Xiaoping did with Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes in 1986. It was the first time the Chinese leader had sat down with a Western TV journalist. The reforming trends, however, alarmed Communist Party hardliners, who made repeated attempts to roll them back, periodically launching campaigns against so-called bourgeois liberalization. Dorinda Elliott, who arrived in 1986 for Newsweek, tried to interview a farmer in the countryside about one such anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, an experience which gives a good sense of the challenges journalists face then.
And as a journalist, this was personally no easy thing. You had to go through the foreign affairs office of the, province, and then it got down to the town level, whatever. By the time I got to the village, I probably had 20, Chinese, officials, Communist Party officials following me. And I remember going into this farmer's house, and I'm trying to have a conversation with this farmer in Chinese. But in the meantime, like 15 or 20 government officials come into this tiny little house with me, and the entire village is basically looking through the window. The family of farmers are totally terrified, have no idea what's going on. So I turn to this woman and I say, so tell me, what do you think about the bourgeois liberalization campaign and what's going on? And she says, she looks absolutely terrified, doesn't know what to say. And she says, well, the reason that we're supposed to support bourgeois liberalization is because, and you could see the officials saying, no, you're supposed to be opposing bourgeois liberalization. And, I felt like, oh my God, what have I done to this poor farmer?
With the huge pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere, 1989 became a watershed moment in the history of media coverage of China. Due to an accident of history, the visit by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, which the Chinese authorities wanted to be widely covered, CNN and other broadcasters were given permission to bring in large satellite dishes and other equipment. Then the protesting students literally stole the stage where the Sino-Soviet summit was supposed to take place. The live broadcasts, and today when it's possible to transmit video live from almost anywhere with an iPhone, it's easy to lose sight of just how unprecedented such coverage was, captured attention around the world, and it presented a picture of China utterly different from the narrative the Communist Party had long sought to impose on foreign journalists. But on the night of June 3rd, 4th, 1989, the People's Liberation Army was ordered to crush the protests. The following day, from a balcony of the Beijing hotel, Jonathan Scher, a cameraman for CNN, and Jeff Widener, a photographer for the AP, captured a moment that became one of the iconic images of our times.
Another cameraman said, hey, look at that guy in front of the tank. And I looked at it and said, oh my God, zoomed in on it and started videotaping it. And they were trying to scare him off by shooting over his head. Well, shooting over his head was basically at where our position was. I was the 5th floor, the 4th floor, whatever balcony we were on, but the bullets were so close you could hear them whizzing by. And at that point, we just locked the camera down. It was just too dangerous. There were bullets ricocheting around.
So I'm just like waiting for them to get shot and holding the focus on them, waiting, and it's too far away. And this is too far away. It's too far away. And I look back at the bed, and I had that lens doubler, which would make my 400 and 800. And I have to think, do I gamble? Do I go back to the bed? Maybe I lose the shot, or do I just shoot this wider? So I took a chance and I ran to the bed, got it, put it on the camera, opened the aperture up all the way. 1, 2, 3 shots.
The images of the man in front of the tank became a symbol of a crackdown which shocked the world, and the coverage of Tiananmen Square produced a sea change, especially in American perceptions of China. As the 1990s arrived, the U.S. press corps remained focused on the bitter legacy of 1989 and the repression that still enveloped Beijing. In such a climate, with so much of the story revolving around human rights, many reporters did not initially appreciate the moves by Deng Xiaoping, which started in 1992 with his famous Southern tour to revive his program of economic reform. But the attention of the American press corps swiftly shifted to chronicling the dramatic economic, social, and even political changes triggered by the boom. The new atmosphere also led to a significant improvement in conditions for foreign journalists. It became much easier to travel, and local officials were much more accessible, often asking reporters for advice about how to attract foreign investment. By the late 1990s, the China beat was entering what Keith Richburg of the Washington Post described as its golden age.
This is some amazing transformation that's going on in China right now. Beijing was kind of really exploding as it went from being this kind of difficult place for correspondents to live to being actually kind of fun.
It was an exhilarating period. China's economy was turning into the manufacturing hub for the world, and American journalists were able to dig into Chinese society in ways that had previously been difficult, if not impossible, trying to make sense of the paradoxes of a society where a dissident would be jailed one day and the next day you'd be covering the opening of the world's largest airport or another Chinese entrepreneur who'd become a millionaire. 2008 was the climax of this period when Beijing hosted the Summer Olympics. In the run-up to the Games, the government lifted many long-standing restrictions on the movements and activities of foreign correspondents. In the wake of the Games, however, China's domestic political climate and its external behavior began to change. The financial crisis that rocked the West in 2008 and 2009 convinced Chinese leaders that the United States was a declining power and that the time was right for China to show a more assertive face to the rest of the world, and that included its treatment of the foreign media. For foreign reporters, covering China became an increasingly tense game of cat and mouse with the authorities. Here's one of many examples. The actor Christian Bale, the star of Batman and other movies, who was in China to promote a new film, wanted to meet the blind dissident lawyer Chen Guangcheng. Bale was accompanied by CNN's Stan Grant and a camera crew. Outside Chen's village, just a few hours' drive from Beijing, however, they were set upon by local security personnel.
Why can I not go to Hollywood actor Christian Bale is used to action, but this is no movie set. We've been stopped. Plain clothes, Chinese security who would not identify themselves, determined to stop him and our crew contacting a detained human rights activist. No, watch it, Christian. Watch. We're trying to get out of here. Once again, we've been stopped. We've been stopped right here. And as you can see, they're pushing Christian here. We're just trying to leave peacefully. We're trying to leave peacefully.
Government anger at the US press intensified in 2012 when Michael Forsyth and his colleagues at Bloomberg News produced an expose showing that relatives of then Vice President Xi Jinping had made millions of dollars in a host of businesses. At the same time, the New York Times' David Barboza used publicly available corporate documents to uncover how relatives of Premier Wen Jiabao controlled numerous companies and had made millions of dollars.
Every time we requested a company, we found 10 more. So if you can imagine, this big chart is you have, like, even with Ping An, behind Ping An are 30 companies, and then behind those, it ends up any company you look at. I continue to work out a strategy of how to do it without setting off alarm bells, without letting people know, thinking about who was going to be translating, what I could show people, and also to go around to lawyers, accountants, bankers, and test some of the theories without giving them what I was doing, because that was too sensitive.
The stories broke new ground as an example of a new kind of investigative journalism for covering a rapidly changing China. The correspondents took advantage of China's evolution towards a more internationally engaged market-style economy to unravel complex and often hidden business dealings reaching to the highest levels of the People's Republic. Retaliation from Beijing was swift. Michael Forsyth received death threats and had to leave the country. The websites of both news organizations were blocked in China, and their reporters had trouble getting visas. By the middle of the decade, Xi Jinping's aggressive campaign to consolidate power made conditions for journalists even more difficult, with intensified harassment, threats, and further delays in approving visas. Xi Jinping's rise and the abrupt policy shifts he implemented, including rolling back key elements of the reform program that had underpinned China's economic miracle and making himself, in effect, emperor for life, came as a surprise, even a shock. Many reporters didn't see it coming. There was even speculation when he first took power that he was going to be a reformist. Boy, did a lot of people get that one wrong. Yet in fairness, 2 points are worth making. One is that Xi's moves, especially the ending of term limits so he could rule forever, essentially, came as a shock to most Chinese as well. Indeed, in Assignment China, Jane Perlez of the New York Times talks to me about how she called a Chinese academic source that she dealt with before, a nationalist who had been sympathetic to a lot of Xi's policies, to ask him his response when Xi abolished term limits. And what he said to her was, "I can't talk about it, Jane. I just can't talk about it. I'm too shocked." And he hung up. And I think this underscores a broader, crucially important point. High-level Chinese politics have always been opaque, secretive, a challenge to figure out. Under Xi Jinping, they have become even more so. Indeed, there's a kind of irony that even though China is more open and accessible now than during the Mao years, that Xi and other leaders travel, meet other foreign leaders, address organizations like the World Economic Forum in Davos, and so on, our knowledge of the inner workings at the pinnacle of power in China is less, arguably, than during Mao's times. So American and other foreign journalists are not alone in being able to penetrate the wall of secrecy. Nonetheless, American journalists persisted in doing what they could, and that was surprisingly quite a lot, including exposing the massive campaign of repression targeting Uyghur Muslims in the far western province of Xinjiang, coverage which helped make Chinese government policy in Xinjiang into a major international issue. But conditions for reporters continued to deteriorate. In 2019, the Foreign Correspondents Club of China released its annual report, in which 82% of the correspondents surveyed said they'd experienced harassment, interference, or violence while reporting, and 70% said that they'd had interviews canceled due to the actions of the Chinese authorities. Access shrank further during the early days of COVID, when nearly 20 journalists from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal were expelled. Those kicked out included Chao Deng of the Wall Street Journal and Chris Buckley of the New York Times, both of whom had stayed in Wuhan, where the outbreak originated, and done important reporting when the city was locked down at the start of the epidemic. Beijing justified the expulsions as a response to decisions by the Trump administration to cap the number of staff at 4 state-run Chinese media outlets in the US. But the move decimated the American press corps in China. With just a handful of reporters there now, that has largely meant having to cover China from outside the country. Kind of modern-day version of the art of China watching that emerged in Hong Kong in the 1950s has become increasingly important. But there are new tools and resources beyond just trying to decipher the state-run media. These include monitoring the Chinese internet, which despite censorship can still provide critical insights. Here's one recent fascinating example that was appeared in the New York Times. Times reporters collected the obituaries publicly published since January 2019 on their official websites by the Chinese Academy of Engineering and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and discovered that while there were usually 3 or 4 obituaries every month, once the Chinese government abandoned its zero COVID policy last December, the number of obituaries shot up dramatically. It was terrific reporting and provided powerful evidence that the government's official death toll did not reflect a much grimmer reality. Indeed, there are now a host of new online publications exclusively devoted to following the Chinese internet and the Chinese media more broadly. They include What's on Weibo, run by a Dutch China specialist, Manja Koetze, which charts what appears in the Chinese version of Twitter. Sinocism, run by American China expert Bill Bishop, which offers summaries, analysis, and links to major Chinese media stories. And the China Media Project, which does something similar. In addition, commercially available satellite imagery, which was used to uncover the detention camps in Xinjiang, has also become increasingly important. More recently, reporters used satellite images to document unusually high activity at crematoriums across China. See all the cars in the parking lot in the image on the right from late December of last year, compared to an empty parking lot in early December. Another example of journalists circumventing official secrecy to confirm the rising death toll caused by Beijing's abrupt abandonment of the zero COVID policy. In addition, we're now seeing the growing importance of AI, such as this newsletter produced by two China watchers in Hong Kong called 5 Things on China's Leaders' Minds. This uses software that can analyze web content for any keyword, sector, or individual to determine how often certain material appears. It's a way of showing what issues are preoccupying Chinese leaders and what they want officials in the system to think about. Moreover, China's growing international involvement is also providing opportunities for reporters. One recent example was this long Wall Street Journal piece about problems in China's, in many Chinese, high-profile Chinese construction projects that are part of China's highly publicized Belt and Road Initiative. The reporters talked to people in Peru, Pakistan, Uganda, Angola, and elsewhere. Interestingly, although they requested comment from Chinese embassies, companies, and the central government, no one was willing to speak with them. This cuts to one major issue that has long affected American and other foreign news coverage of China, and that's the continued unwillingness of Chinese authorities to engage in meaningful ways with reporters. As you can see from this example, and there are countless others, reporters try hard to get the Chinese perspective, but their requests for interviews or access are routinely rebuffed. The upshot is not that a story won't get done. Reporters are still going to file, still going to meet their deadlines, but stories are unlikely to contain as extensive or nuanced a portrayal of Chinese views and thinking as they might otherwise. But that is not the fault of the reporter. Nor is it a function of bias, despite the claims one so often hears from Beijing and its supporters of how the Western media is biased, that it's anti-China, that it has an agenda to defame China, and so on. In fact, as I've tried to indicate, responsible reporters want to get input from all sides on important stories, but they have to do their jobs, and they'll end up putting the story out with whatever material they can gather by their filing deadline. If the Chinese side won't engage, then it has only itself to blame. There's another reason for the tension between the American or Western press and the Chinese authorities, and that has to do with the nature of journalism itself. At its finest, journalism in the US or in the West has functioned to shine a light in dark places, to hold the powerful accountable, to be a voice for the voiceless. That's true for a correspondent, whether he or she is in Beijing or Washington or Moscow or London or Jerusalem or Delhi or Johannesburg. That's one central reason why so many governments don't like the press. And I think especially in China, there's a clash between the Chinese Communist Party's impulse towards total control and our notion of what good journalism is. This, by the way, is the late Dave Schweisberg, who was UPI's bureau chief in Beijing in the late 80s and early 90s and was a great reporter. And in fact, it's worth emphasizing that this is not just a Western notion. In Asia, for instance, you have a relatively free press in Japan, in South Korea, here in Taiwan. You had it in Hong Kong before Beijing imposed its national security law. You see it even in the Philippines, where my old friend Maria Ressa won the Nobel Peace Prize for efforts to report on issues the authorities there didn't want covered. So it's not a function of reporters being, quote, anti-China. Indeed, I would say that most of the journalists who appear in Assignment China really like China. China was a passion. It was a calling. I know in my own case that was true. I was entranced by China long before I became a journalist. In fact, I became a journalist because I was entranced by China and thought back in the early 1970s that being a journalist offered a possible way to get to China when the country was largely cut off from the United States. Most journalists who spend the time to learn Chinese and study the country and agree to live there and bring their families there, despite all the difficulties, don't do so because they hate China. They do so because they like it. They're fascinated by it. They want to experience it. Indeed, I think one of the most unfortunate consequences of the sharp drop in American media access to China is that the ability of reporters who are basically positively disposed towards the people of China to go around the country, to talk to folks, to witness for themselves what's going on, has been so severely limited. Being there is the essential foundation for good journalism, and that's becoming harder and harder to do. The result is that even more of the coverage is becoming focused on the tensions and conflicts driving the US and China apart, since the official statements and diplomatic and sometimes military maneuvering is easier to follow and report on. What is increasingly missing is the ability of journalists to convey the richness and complexity and humanity of the world's most populous nation, a shared humanity we also need to understand, especially as the US and China lurch ever closer to confrontation. So let me stop there. Thank you for your attention, and we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Terrific presentation. Really summed up the arc of coverage and really bringing it back to pretty much where it started. I think that was terrific. A couple of questions are already in. Denny Roy asks a question that's near and dear to my heart, which is given the difference in the way American journalists are treated in China and Chinese journalists are treated in the United States, should there be more reciprocity applied in that case and how they're treated?
In principle, absolutely. The Chinese play hardball. They certainly see a reluctance by successive American administrations to play hardball in return as a sign of weakness. But it's complicated for a number of reasons. One is that unlike the Chinese Communist Party, the United States has a tradition of valuing freedom of expression, free access, free information. So you have to balance that. And also, as we saw in the expulsions in 2020, I think, the Chinese got a much better end of that. They got rid of reporters who were digging into Chinese society and providing insights with a level of depth and sophistication you otherwise wouldn't have. The US got rid of some people who were working for Chinese propaganda outlets. So if you're going to do reciprocity, I think it has to be done extremely carefully. It has to be done in a quiet, low profile way. In the tit for tat department, the Chinese give just as good as they get. And I think, as I say, in 2020, they ended up better off and we ended up worse off. So I'm not against it in principle, but I think it has to be done very skillfully and carefully.
Well, I think one of the problems is that traditionally there had been zero reciprocity. So there are quite a few more Chinese journalists in the United States than vice versa. I'm reminded of my favorite Jim Lilly story when Cheryl Wu Dunn was not able to get her visa renewed after Tiananmen. And so Lilly told the consul officials not to give any new visas to Chinese journalists until Cheryl got hers. Nothing happened because it turned out the Chinese couldn't figure out what it was the Americans were doing. They'd never seen something called reciprocity before. So Lilly sent his consular official over to the foreign ministry, explained what was happening, and Cheryl got her visa right away. Anyway, so Bev Burden has asked whether or not, given your vast experience there and what you've watched recently, do you share FBI Director Chris Wray's analysis of the degree of the threat of China to the United States? How do you look at that at this point?
I think it's a very complicated question. I think China does pose some real challenges to the United States, and under Xi Jinping, they have abandoned the low-key approach of Deng Xiaoping and other rulers in the earlier reform period. I don't, there's a distinction. I mean, China is not Nazi Germany trying to conquer the world. I think Xi Jinping's goal is to make the world safe for the Chinese Communist Party. And that means doing whatever they need to do internally and externally to mute or neutralize anything they see as a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And that has involved Chinese behavior in many parts of the world that I think is very troubling. And I think it's good that it's being countered. But I think it's also very important to be measured and careful in the discussion about China. There is an element now of people in Washington falling over themselves, trying to show who's tougher on China. And while I'm all in favor of being tough on China on policies that make sense, this is a large country of 1.3 billion people. It's not going away in one form or another. The US has to learn how to coexist with it. The battle is as much now kind of about what the rules are going to be, because if the two don't coexist, you could end up in World War III. So it's very complicated, and I think that a kind of the climate now also in both capitals of hostility is going to make it extremely difficult to have lines of communication. Even during the height of the Cold War, the leaders spoke to each other. There were summits. There were arms control treaties. There's got to be some way to figure out a mechanism to communicate. I mean, people have talked about putting guardrails on the relationship because of the dangers if it goes off the rails, in a sense. I think it was very troubling, for example, that the Chinese defense minister would not take a phone call from the US Secretary of Defense during this balloon episode. And to me, that underscores what I think is one of the most worrying kind of elements in the current dynamic, which is the ability of the two sides to manage a crisis, particularly one that's not anticipated, is very much in question. I'm reminded of the EP-3 spy plane case in 2001, which I covered for CNN. And it took 2 weeks before the Chinese agreed to release 24 Americans who were detained after their surveillance aircraft made an emergency landing in Hainan Island after Chinese fighter jet collided with the plane and the Chinese pilot was killed. It was very tense. There were lots of criticisms of President Bush for not being tougher, but they found a way out of it. And that happened with Bush being interested in having a good relationship with China and Chinese leader Jiang Zemin being interested in having a good relationship with the US. China was just going into the WTO and so on. And even that was very fraught. So if something like that happens today, we could really be in trouble, and not by design, but I'm a great believer in what I call the cock-up theory of international relations. And I think that worries me greatly. So I have no problem with being tough on China in a sensible way. But the operative word here is sensible, because if this relationship gets out of control, everybody loses.
Yeah, and I think back to one of your comments, which I really appreciated, about the opacity of the Chinese governing system. I mean, it really is getting back to pretty much the way it was, 50 years ago. And I've always had problems with colleagues who pretended to know what was being said in Zhongnanhai. The only people that know what's going on there live there. But you don't really know who to call at this point, because it's not the Minister of Defense. It's somebody in Xi Jinping's closest party circle. There's a, let's see. Oh yeah, this is interesting. So you discussed the, how most American journalists who went to China were predisposed to China, but isn't there sort of an implicit bias? This is something you hear quite a lot about Western journalists in China. We're not really Chinese. We can't really understand Chinese society. How do you navigate, putting aside your own cultural background so that you can, do justice to what people are saying and doing there?
Well, I think fundamentally it's by applying the basic principles of good journalism. It's worth noting, just parenthetically, that in more recent years, the composition of the American press corps changed. At the beginning, there were very, very few ethnic Chinese or Chinese Americans. Melinda Liu of Newsweek, who opened the Newsweek Bureau, was really Frank Ching of the Wall Street Journal were really the only two at the time. But in more recent years, you've had a large number of people who were ethnically Chinese, some of whom were born and raised in the West, in the States or Australia or Canada, others of whom were born in China or whose parents immigrated from China. Ching Ni, who went for the Los Angeles Times in the early 2000s, was born and raised in Beijing, and was the first person born in the People's Republic to go back as a foreign correspondent covering the People's Republic. So you have had until the numbers were cut very dramatically by the expulsions. You have had a growing proportion of the American press corps who came with more of the background, who had native level Chinese who could mix in a way that those of us like myself who studied Chinese for years, but I open my mouth and I'm certainly not a Chinese person. But that's part of it. But people are aware of the baggage they bring, and part of what you do. I mean, I believe very strongly journalism is a craft, and it has certain values. It's not just putting out stuff. And unfortunately, the emergence of the internet and social media is a very double-edged sword. It's a wonderful way to transmit information and to hear about things we didn't otherwise know before, but it also allows anybody to say anything, and it gets a certain amount of traction. But journalists who come in who have those values and have the high degree of professionalism and are trained to ask questions and probe and be aware of what they know and be aware of what they don't know can still do a pretty good job, I think.
No, I agree. That's always something I told my students. Basically your first job is to recognize your own implicit biases, put them up on a box above your word processor, and keep looking up at it repeatedly. Make sure you don't forget. This is a fascinating question. Ash Ramani, you may not have the answer, but is there any role for the WTO in promoting access for digital media companies in China? As you pointed out, they've blocked the New York Times. Well, they've blocked almost all digital media. Is that not a WTO issue in some way?
It's possible.
Yeah.
If a government wanted to take that route, it would be very interesting to see what the WTO would say, and it would be even more interesting to see how China would respond. The Chinese kind of pick and choose. Chinese Communist Party picks and chooses what international standards it will or will not apply. Remember it was the international legal assessment about the South China Sea brought by the Philippines, which China just categorically rejected.
Right.
It would be an interesting device to try, but I'm not aware that anyone has tried it. And certainly in the current climate, I don't think that the Chinese are suddenly going to allow all these digital outlets. They've only given a credential for one purely digital news outlet, and that was BuzzFeed News. And Megha Rajagopalan who's a terrific reporter, did the first big expose of the camps in Xinjiang, and they didn't renew her visa, and that was the end of that.
Yeah. I mean, actually, I think there is, again, some reciprocity going on, because the Chinese have bought some radio stations in the United States, which is something the US, American companies cannot do in China. And I believe the FCC is quietly sort of rolling those up. What about, you mentioned these new ethnic Chinese reporters. Do you see any difference? I mean, can you tell a difference when you're reading what their stuff or looking at their copy? I certainly can't.
Well, I would say most of the reporters for American and other media who make it to China get that responsibility of that assignment are good reporters, are good writers, and you get very top quality journalism. But certainly somebody who's got native level Chinese is going to, with greater ease, kind of access parts of Chinese society that otherwise would not be easily accessible. That they'll be much less reliant on office assistants and translators to help guide them. They control the Chinese internet much more readily. They can fit in. I mean, I interviewed a number of reporters who talked about how because they looked and sounded Chinese, they could get to places. So it certainly does make the access part easier, but it also brings with it certain risks. For example, in Assignment China, Alice Su, the LA Times, talks about going to Inner Mongolia when the authorities were sort of rolling back Mongolian language teaching and making everybody study Mandarin. and she was waiting outside of school, and she got detained, which is something that happens frequently to reporters. But the police who detained her did not accept that she was not Chinese, and she was given a very, very scary time in the police station until they realized, oh my goodness, we really got an American here. We better let her go. So it cuts both ways, but I think it does open doors that somebody who looks and sounds like me simply are not going to have open for them.
Yeah, we have a few other questions, but we're running out of time, so I'm just going to finish with this one because I think it's a great way to end this. If there was one thing that you could change about how the coverage of China is currently done, what would it be?
I think, the thing that I would like to see changed is the access that the Chinese Communist Party grants to its society. I would like to see reporters being able to go out and park themselves in a village in Hubei for 2 weeks and come back. So I guess that's part A, and part B is, and this is something that's easier said than done because of the nature of the changing nature of the news business. Unfortunately, with so many news outlets now having an online version, a print version, the pressure for journalists to always be there, always file, always update. I mean, it was hard enough at CNN was the first 24-hour news channel, the 24-hour news cycle. Now it's every second news cycle. And I think one of the consequences of that is that unless a news organization has huge numbers of staff and vast resources, the ability of the news organization to let its reporter go sit in a village in Hubei for 2 weeks is also much more limited. And so as a result, what is missing, and which I think, as I tried to mention in my remarks, is the sense of China as a kind of living, breathing society full of real human beings who get on with their lives, for which the high politics are a backdrop, but that doesn't affect what they necessarily do every day, but gives us a sense of China as a richer, more complex, more human society, which I think we need more than ever, given the climate is becoming less and less likely. So that is what I would like to see change, but I'm not very optimistic we're going to see that change. Yeah, I recently read Peter Hessler's New Yorker piece going back to sort of re-report the river, his book, and it really reminded me of what we are missing now. I mean, the richness of these people, their creativity, the depths of their intellects, their souls. It was just so moving. And you're right, it's very hard. It's hard to do that kind of reporting in any case. And it's worth noting that Peter Hessler's visa wasn't renewed. So here's somebody who has a great deal of empathy for China and has written pioneered a way of writing about China that goes beyond the Xinhua news agency today said this, President Biden said that, and the Chinese system couldn't accommodate that either. So I think it's a reflection of where things are at in China at the moment. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we both agree that in many ways China is its own worst enemy when it comes to dealing with the Western press. I mean, it's really a shame because people really are trying to get down to the nitty-gritty. Maybe some of it is stuff that the Chinese government doesn't particularly want to know itself. I'm going to reverse myself and ask one more question because Henderson has asked, what about, and back to the sort of reciprocity thing, what about Voice of America? Hasn't it kept its bureaus in China? Is it available? I'd have to double check whether there was I mean, they certainly were for a very long time, and they were an important source for Chinese of news. But I think I'm not absolutely sure at the moment if there's a VOA person there. Right. I mean, the COVID restrictions made it really impossible to get in if you weren't already there. but certainly, I mean, for example, in 1989, VOA was absolutely crucial in communicating to Chinese people what was going on
Mhm.
in Tiananmen
Yes.
Square, and their own media
Yeah.
wouldn't cover it. So it's important research.
Yeah. Yes, and I think there was a distinction made between Radio Free Asia and Radio Voice of America by the Chinese in terms of what they allowed and didn't allow. Well, Mike, this has been really terrific, and we wish you the best on your upcoming multi-city tour. I think a lot of people will benefit from hearing your description of how China has been covered, and it's an important time, an important book, and thanks for putting me on the cover.
Oh, well, I'm delighted. Better than putting me on the cover.
Anyway, thanks very much. I'm going